Hello and welcome back to another episode of They Don't Teach This in Law School. I'm Charlie Mann of law firm Alchemy, and today I'm really stoked to talk with a buddy of mine who I ran a bunch of miles with last year, who I've gotten to know increasingly over the last 14 months, and someone who I don't even know he knows how much I respect him and who he is and what he's brought into my life. So it's just kind of a treat to sit down and have a conversation and bring this person into the lives of everyone who listens to this show. I met him through our mutual friend, Tony Albrecht, while participating in the Elevate Mastermind through Unration last year, which if you're looking for an opportunity to challenge yourself, please go see what these guys are doing over at Unration. But he is the co-founder and CEO of Mission Matters Group, my good buddy, Josh Aranda. Great to talk with you, my friend.
Great to talk to you as well. Thank you. That was a very nice welcome. I feel honored and embarrassed. So thank you.
Good. Then I absolutely achieved my goal that I set out for. So, Josh, I know you're not a lawyer, but what's the one thing they don't teach you in law school?
Yeah, I was thinking about this coming into here, and the item that I talk about most frequently, which I think begs the question of like, why didn't somebody teach me this? And it's really around the balancing act between home life and work life. Yeah,
That's a tough one.
that's a tough. Why don't they teach you this in law school? That's what I've been asking my whole life.
Literally anywhere. So I'm curious. I mean, I know you're someone who values your family deeply. Like literally, you go to your LinkedIn profile, and the about section starts with a discussion about your family, and that's like the first couple paragraphs of that thing. So before getting into like the how do you handle it stuff, I'm curious, that anchoring for you, Josh, of home life versus work life, is that something you always saw demonstrated when you were younger, or was it something you had to pick up along the way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was probably high school, and it was a Friday night, and everybody's like, "Hey, what are you gonna do this weekend?" And I was like, you know what? I'm like gonna go home, have dinner with my family, and then I'll meet you all out afterwards. And I got the craziest looks from my friends, like, "What is wrong with you? Why don't you just come out now?" And I think in that moment, I realized that it was a bit of a unique situation, and that like we
Yeah.
always had meals together. Like my parents showed up at a lot of my sports activities, or they just made an extra effort. I'm the baby of five. So making an extra effort for me was like significant because there was four
Yeah.
people older than me that, demanded their attention. And so even though my dad traveled for work a lot, they did instill in this like really deep desire of like keeping our family unit tight. I'm very blessed, very fortunate to have like uh, most of my upbringing, both my sets of grandparents alive and involved in my family. So
Wow.
I just had this really tight family unit growing up. And I didn't realize how much that would be put in jeopardy, or how hard my mom and dad had to work throughout their careers until I had kids of my own. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really, really hard. Why didn't anybody tell me this? Where did the time come from? So to do both things well, and that our biggest distraction at work sometimes can be the dynamics that are going on at home. And
Mm.
sometimes our biggest distraction at home can be the stress and the tension and the lack of fulfillment at work. And so I find that threshold of transitioning between those two domains a fascinating concept, and one that I think was modeled pretty well from my parents. I guess I'll kick it over to you if you have more questions in a second, but my mom, I sent her a text on her birthday this year, and I was reflecting on her, and I'm like, she kind of had a thankless setup, meaning
Mm.
my dad he had started a business, and right, it's the cash flow management of business and stuff. And so my mom had gone back to work, and my
Yeah.
mom started working as a medical assistant doing nights, 8-hour shifts at night. So she would leave at like 11 p.m. and come home at like 7 a.m. just in time to like take us to school, go back, get a nap, start her day, and then come pick us up. And so for like
Jeez.
3 to 5 years, she slept probably like 4 hours and, broken sleep and stuff. And, but she was always present, like, and
Yeah.
peaceful. And yeah, it just like blows my mind to this day. And she is somebody that balanced it super, super well and taught us like that perseverance, that fortitude, but at the same time, like make sure first things are first, you know?
So that's super interesting because for some people, they have maybe a really bad example of that growing up, right? They had a parent who was just obsessed with work and that becomes their thing to overcome.
Yeah.
I find a different dynamic for someone like you, Josh, which is you saw it modeled well, but we never, as children, we never see the stress of it all. So there is often an awakening moment of, oh, it turns out this was actually work all along. So I'm
Yeah.
curious for yourself, going through that process of that awakening of, oh, this is actually work. I'm going to have to figure out my way of handling this. This isn't going to be easy. How did you handle that transition?
Yeah. Great question. Two stories are sticking out in my mind. And so I had the great privilege of working with my dad as well. So he's the
Cool.
founder of Mission Matters Group. We got to work together and still collaborate a ton on things. And so it's cool that I'm a second generation running this business.
That's
And I
awesome.
feel like I'm one of those few that have a positive story of being on the other side of this handoff and this transition, and that my relationship with my dad is stronger now. Now, that being said, does not mean that we did not have trials throughout our time together. And so, I don't know if you know this, but I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed in 2014. In 2017, I was out of work for an entire month. And I didn't have kids at this time, but I remember like work was kind of a mess. Tensions were high between me, my dad, and my brother. We had all kinds of projects going on. We were doing everything for the first time, no processes, no systems, all that stuff. And we didn't have a way to handle tension between the three of us.
Mm.
Well, I do attribute my time out because of stress at work, right? So I couldn't like put thoughts and stuff together. I had all this like cramping in my body, and I literally like did not work for a month, and my wife helped take care of me. So like in that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have boundaries. I don't have good personal habits. I don't have stress relieving techniques. And so I doubled down on that. And I think things got better for me personally. I could handle stress on a personal level better. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't fix any root issues. And so you fast forward 2 years in 2019, now I have my first son. He's two or three, or no, he's like about 6 months old. I think this was February of 2019. And
Mm.
I remember just having a super stressful week. And I'm reverting back to bad habits. And I pour this big fat glass of bourbon and I grab my 6 month old son and I like sit down, and he was so peaceful, just like nestled up on my chest.
Mm.
And I remember just like being like a vampire, like sucking every ounce of peace out of that child because I didn't have it in my own life. And at that moment, I realized, oh, this is messed up. This is a lot of work to not just
Mm.
take care of myself, but to create an environment that is peaceful, that is productive, that is ambitious, that is graceful, that is considerate. And I was not doing the work, right? So I had to steal the peacefulness from my child because I couldn't create that environment on my own. And the
Wow.
thing that I had to point at was myself and my responsibility at work. At which point I was like, okay, things have to change, or I can just accept this as my known factor. And also I have to say thank you for my mom and dad for realizing that if this happened between me, my dad, and my brother in the business that we were creating, think about all the hard work that they had to do before that to create that
Right.
environment for us. And so I was like, dude, I got to get to work. So,
So what did that, I mean, that whole process, like let's put in the work there. What did that look like?
yeah, well, I love like framework systems. And one of the things was that we didn't really have a great way of resolving tension between the leadership team at Mission Matters Group, right? So this was me,
Yeah.
my dad, and my brother, and any disconnect of alignment created friction. And I'll own this. I apologized to my dad probably like 3 years later, where it's like probably that like weird son father dynamic, like maybe I can do it better than daddy. And
Yep.
and I don't think I was a good soldier a lot of the time, where I was like, oh man,
Mm.
my dad was set in a direction, but I didn't get in line because of some ego trip or whatever. And so I had to own that and saying like, hey man, I created that tension pulling in a little different direction. So I think just like all three of us getting on the same page and figuring out how we were going to move forward together as a single unit or together in just a little bit different roles and capacities. And so that was one, just like the clarity between the three of us. And then after that, how do we adopt systems to cascade that type of clarity and alignment throughout the rest of the organization? And that's really when we started adopting, organizational operating systems, getting really, really clear on our vision, making sure we're, the things that you would read in Lencioni or Traction or whatever, like
Yeah.
making sure that we're reinforcing that. And as cliche as it sounds, like the books kind of have the playbook. It's just really, really hard to follow through with it and show up authentically and, with grace when you make a mistake. So anyways, those were some of the brass tacks things that went into play. And then I think like kind of going back to that story in 2017 as well, I realized that I still hadn't I was thinking like, oh, I'm in a good spot. And I think the moment that you think you're in a good spot, things start to get out of whack too. And so I think just continually,
Universe is funny that way, right?
yeah, funny. Funny is a good way to describe that. But just like making sure I don't stop refining my own personal rhythms and my personal, just like questioning how am I showing up for the people in my life, and is that representing what I aspire to be like?
That's so, but I mean, that's so difficult. That exact thing that you talked about, what you aspire to be in the lives of others, how you aspire to show up for others, and then the reality of what happens day to day. You've got kids, you've got a wife who started her own business as well. You've got multiple entities in which you are involved. That's a lot of things pulling you in multiple directions. I mean, this is one of the things I respect about you. And one of my points of curiosity is, how do you show up for people? I'll do a quick drop. You just flew out to go run 20 miles with our buddy Mike as part of his 100-mile ultra marathon. Like, you're going and showing up for people who matter to you in that way, but you're showing up for a lot of people. How do you do that, Josh?
I would say this is one of those times where I feel really embarrassed and uncomfortable right now. But
good, perfect.
Uh,
And by the way, let me say, like, here's one thing that I believe to know about you. You carry yourself in such a way where you have clearly done a lot. Like, you have accomplished things of which you should be proud, and yet you never hold that pride too close to yourself, whether that is instinctual or something that you've developed over time. But right here, while we're talking, let me say, everyone, this is a man who's earned it. And, I also know that he knows that he's still earning it and feels like he hasn't earned it, and all of those things at the same time. So with all that in mind, Josh, how do you do it?
Well, again, to go back to a story. So I played soccer in college, and my freshman year of college, I was on the traveling team, but I wasn't getting a lot of playing time. And my uncle, so he was my dad's sister's husband, he passed away pretty tragically. And it was an interesting story, and I won't get into those details, but I remember making a conscious decision that I traveled with my team, and I didn't go to his funeral.
Oh.
And fast forward like 5 years, I went out to visit my cousin, and we were hanging out, way too late, and playing ping pong and having beers. And then we were just chatting afterwards, and he shared with me the hurt that he had for not being there. And at that point I was like, damn, never again. Like, to know that a simple decision of not being at a moment of pain and suffering and hurt and not showing up and realizing what that decision caused in somebody, and to only find out about it 5 years. I could have hypothesized, like I could have assumed that this would cause hurt, and yet I was absorbed in wanting to get playing time or whatever. Maybe I didn't think I was that important in that person's life. Whatever excuse, that is exactly what it was, is an excuse. And I didn't show up for somebody that I cared about and that I love, that is, family. And so at that point I was like, am I clear on who am I clear in expressing how much I care for people? And
Mm.
if I am, great, but am I showing up with actions? And my grandparents and my parents are like great at this. They like just show up for people. Like they'll drive across the country to like go see my 6 year old's Christmas concert. And it's just like, come on, man, that's amazing.
That
And so I'm
is.
like, if that moves me, then why am I not modeling my life after that? And you never know the cascading effect of that decision will have in somebody's life. And so anyways, it's just like and I'm so grateful to my wife because she like supports me in this, and it's more of like a family value. It's just like, we got to
Mm.
show up, even if it's not easy, even if it's not convenient, even if it sucks, even if it costs money, like show up. Otherwise, what do we stand for if we say that that's a value of ours?
So that idea of like you and your wife having some of these common values. I mean, let's be honest. Most of us, when we get married, like we have a sense of like, hey, we got a good vibe here, right? Like there's clearly some alignment. But I don't think anyone sits down before they get married and go, okay, so let's figure out what our core values are
Yeah.
within this marriage, and how we're going to handle all of this. Like over time, was this a conscious processing that you and your wife went through on all of that?
Yeah, great question. It was about 3 months before Jack, our oldest son, came into the picture, and we're like, we got to try and do this right. And it's like, if we don't have something to point to as we're making decisions or
Mm,
prioritizing things, like we'll be a little off kilter. And I had great examples from like a business perspective. So I worked at
yeah.
this company called Worldwide Technology, and they were amazing with their values, like so values driven, made decisions that were very, very like in alignment. And I just always valued that. And so, going into having children, it's like, if we are expecting a standard of behavior, we have to define it and then we have to live that out. And so that was a super fun process. And then it was kind of cool. Like, I can get nerdy with like business stuff and how I like want to apply it to family. I think I'm
Yeah.
in good company.
Trust me, you this podcast, you found a home for all of that.
um, so my wife, like you mentioned, she started a gym. She's a nurse by training, and just like had this like really, profound experience at a gym that ended up shutting down. She brought it back to Colorado Springs. And
Mm,
anyways, the franchise is really great about operating systems and defining this stuff. And so it was cool as she was doing it for her business. And we've talked about it on a family level. It was just like this renewed vigor to like, okay, let's get into our annual planning rhythm as a family. And so at the end of 2022, we went back to like our family values. We went back to our family goals, and we just kind of like did a refresh. And it was cool to see some of the adaptations of it. But we both see the importance in our business lives, and we know the importance in our family life. And then it can make some of these decisions less about an emotional thing and rather following through with what we already committed to and we know to be right and good for our family. And so it kind
yeah.
of decouples some of the emotional charging, if you will.
So with you and your wife both having kind of this shared business type of framework, well, it's interesting with your wife being a nurse. My wife's a nurse as well. That is not a space. As a matter of fact, nursing has one of the lowest rates of entrepreneurship of any profession in the United States. So she ended up, completely out kicking the coverage on that expectation. Had she always had a little bit of a entrepreneurial curiosity, or was this completely new for her?
This was completely new.
Oh,
Yeah, this was not in her. It was like this deep conviction that like, it was funny. I went to the gym once, and this was probably like 2021. And I was like, I could see us owning one of these one day. And I'm like, brainstorming these things. And Laura's like, shut up. So a year goes by, and we're like, we should talk to the other owners, like, see if they'd ever sell. This is February. We find out we're pregnant with our third, and then like we put that on the back burner. And then it
sure.
shuts down. And then it was like, my wife's like, no way is this going to leave. It doesn't have to be me, but I'm going to push this thing forward. And
Mm.
so it was like a group of like 7, 8 women. And as we started getting to the meat of it and like entertaining the really bad stuff and the really good stuff, Like
Right.
people started, dropping like flies, and it just ended up being two people. And I think, my wife's a perfectionist. She's an Enneagram 1. She's like deep seated conviction. She like, there's a right way to do things.
Mm,
And I think she like knew that it was right for Byrne to be back in the Colorado Springs community. And she knew that because no one else was stepping up, that she had to do it. So it was
mm.
more out of like obligation as opposed to like entrepreneurship. But she's a freaking good leader. Like she's a baller.
That's amazing. I mean, truly, that's amazing. So it's interesting that you were having these discussions much earlier on, before you had your oldest, solidifying these things that often feel corporate, like the core values, what are our mission, our purpose, our goals that we're trying to achieve, and now she's using that in business. My point of curiosity, like layered in there, is for a lot of folks, starting that type of discussion feels strange because oftentimes, especially with this audience, there's the law firm owner who has that entrepreneurial experience. They're bought in on the idea of systems, process, et cetera. But it's the how do I find that buy-in from my spouse? How do I open up this discussion and make it productive? So I'm curious for you, Josh, like, was there a way that you helped instigate that? Was there something that came to the table? Like, how could we help people jump off on that?
Yeah, great question. If I were to rewind back to 2017 or 2018, I guess, I think because of the third party in the mix, it
Mm,
created this common ground. Whereas if I had approached this conversation beforehand, like, what are your goals? What are the values that we're, the standard of behavior that we're expecting in our marriage? I think I probably did this and I've just like blocked it out. But once we made it about that third party, that new entity, and our responsibility that we agreed to, that we shared, it kind of depressurized it a little bit. And I think we did like start small as well. Like, let's just like
mm,
dream a little bit and saying, like, what's going to help us raise an awesome kid in the way that we want to raise this kid. And I think, in my approach, I get to work with some really impressive leaders and organizations. And I think just like always like making sure I'm checking myself and holding things open handed. Like if I like
mhm,
have a prescriptive set of values that I want us to live by, and I'm just like, you know, listening so that I can like affirm when she hits the right word, that's not actually creating shared values to raise a child. And so I think I had to prepare my heart and my approach in a way that said, no, this really is about this kiddo. What can we agree to make it the best for them? And so I think abstracting that or decoupling it being like a mom and dad thing and saying like, what are we doing for this family unit for these kiddos? That was helpful for me. And same thing, like if it's like a business, like sometimes we want a value that we believe in, but it's not necessarily present inside of
mm.
our organizations. And so how do we actually observe and saying like, what is successful, what's not, where we just, again, going to like a Lencioni or, a good degree, like what is aspirational
Yeah.
versus like, just present. So again, I think thinking about that kiddo, trying to decouple it and just saying like, how do we constantly create common ground? And it's like, it's not about me or you, it's about what we're building together, was helpful for me.
You related to that. I know that you have your 6 levers framework that helps, business owners have that organizational structure, that leadership structure. Things I find really interesting between the parallel between discussions with a spouse about goals for family, goals for a business is the tendency sometimes to take a framework, and some
Mm.
people are hyper strict about frameworks and they don't want to color outside the lines. And then there are other people who see a framework and they're like, how can I bend and otherwise break this
Yeah, yeah.
because it is exactly my human nature? I'm curious where you tend to fall on that
Oh,
spectrum.
oh, great question. I'm shameless. I will take whatever will serve the objective.
Nice.
I
I
am
like
I
it.
am shameless with that, where it's like, my wife's like, how are you reading so many books at a time? I'm like, I read until I get a nugget that I can like apply, and I will pull that in and start putting it into my life. And then I'll just like wait till I'm ready to like encounter something else. As much as I like, that's what I love about 6 levers, is that we originally designed it to be modular. And
Mm,
inside of it, we want to point to the greats. Like, hey, there's things that will sound so tangential or similar to things that you would read in a bunch of other books. That is great. And we want to give credit to where credit is due. But then
yeah.
there's also some other things that you can layer in. And at the end of the day, I don't believe it's to follow a system to the letter of the law. It's to achieve the objective that's making you want to adopt a system in the first place. And so if we
Mm.
forget about that, we make it about the system as opposed to what we're trying to achieve together. And then all of a sudden the tail's wagging the dog. And so I am totally shameless when it comes to I will merge EOS, 4 disciplines of execution, scaling up in 6 levers, and I will be happy as can be. But for people who don't know where to start, having kind of the kit and caboodle in one is super, super helpful. But as you get to a point where you're maturing in that system, you might need to layer in other tools, and that's okay. Um, so yeah, you kind of hit a hot button. I just start to get like pretty amped up about that, where it's like we don't have to be. It's okay if you are rigid, like I don't like, or
Hmm.
you're like very structured. That is awesome. But again, at the end of the day, it's about what you and your team are trying to achieve together. And if it's not working, you got to ask, are we putting the effort? Are we trying to circumnavigate the system? Have we adopted it? And if you answer like, the positive in all those questions, then you say, okay, well, are we just missing a tool that we haven't found yet that we need to layer in and search for?
I love you getting fired up about it because it's something that I get fired up about as well because I look at it as you when you own a business, the objective is not to win the game of I'm the best at using the business operating system,
Yep.
right? You can't the, no one you don't grow wealth by saying I did EOS by the letter of the law.
Yeah.
I did
Yeah.
scaling up by doing literally everything that Vern Harnish lays out in there. And I even took some of his materials from Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. Like, look at how much I did from those
You're an
spaces.
overachiever.
It is about what have I done that can stay endemic to myself over time.
Mm,
So for you, Josh, what are some principles, whether it's from that amalgamation or things that you produce through the 6 levers framework, that you see as endemic to how you operate in business, things you place a high level of priority on?
yeah. Great question. My dad told me in like 2016, we were having a one-on-one and he was giving me feedback.
Nice.
And he was like, hey, you avoid conflict. And if you continue to do that, you will not be as good as you can be.
Mm.
That was the gist of it. And I was like, dang, well, thank you, Dad.
Yeah, that's real.
Dude, but he was so spot on.
Yeah.
And I'm still not amazing at addressing tension or
Hmm.
addressing conflict. I have so much room to grow. But I will say I'm incredibly committed to it.
Mm.
And the way that we kind of work through that inside of 6 levers is there's this concept that we try to hit really hard is just agreements. And what I love about it is that we've created a common vernacular in the teams that I operate in, but also the
Hmm.
teams that I help support in consulting, and saying, how do we create a common vernacular so that when I use some words, when I use specific language, people know that there is a tension that needs to be addressed, and we all have to
Ah.
have our spidey sense going up. And very simply for our team, it's just like, hey, I'm noticing this tension, whether that's internal or whether that's like a team dynamic. And and what we try to do is saying like, okay, let's all talk about it. What is this tension? Is that anybody else observing it? And what are we going to do about it? What is the simplest way to make progress? And then let's put a date on it. And so
Mm.
something as simple as that has been game changing. For instance, it was about a year and a half ago, and our leadership team was like, hey, we all feel like we're on like islands and we're like moving these different things forward, but we don't have a great rhythm of celebrating, we don't have a great rhythm of getting help and support. And so
Right.
we basically said, okay, like what can we do about this? And so we came up with a really simple agreement around how we were going to establish daily priorities, carving out different windows and using the tools at our disposal. And we've put a sunset date that said like, hey, let's try this for 3 months. If we like it, let's lean into it. And if we don't like it, let's get rid of it. But let's at least put in the work to sweat those details. And just the simple framework allows you to quickly address tension and resolve it. Like, I think about it as like, how do we increase our baseline fitness? So it's like we used to do sprints in soccer, like 120s.
Mm.
So you'd sprint all the way down and you'd have to jog back. And the goal of fitness, right? We're trying to decrease our turnaround time to when we can like max perform again. And so
Right.
having some of these agreements in place allow us to decrease our recovery time from when a tension point hits that's causing a inefficiency or a lack of performance because there's personal tension, and how do we do something to decrease that turnaround time to making progress. And so agreements I'm obsessed with.
I love that. And what I love there is you describe something that, I've heard Amazon, for example, they talk about the difference between a one-way door and a two-way door
Mm,
decision.
yeah.
They say like, look, almost every decision is really a two-way door. You can always come back out of it. But so often, especially when a small business is mired in what frequently feels like a crisis situation, even if it's something that when you zoom out, you would say, this is a relatively small decision that you're going to make,
Mm,
which is entirely reversible. There is a fear of taking that time to reverse the decision because we're so obsessed
yeah.
with forward progress all the time. So I'm always curious when someone says, this is something that I'm working on, being better at conflict. How are you consciously working to get better at conflict?
Yeah. Great question. Um, well, the first thing is I'm not always great at giving direct and candid feedback when I'm frustrated.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's kind of like atomic habits, or like, how do I break this down into smaller things? Like, then I started saying like, okay, well, rather than like having this big thing where I'm like, man, I've been frustrated for 2 months and now I'm worried about dropping this bomb on them because why didn't I say it 2 months ago when it first started bothering me?
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to do is just kind of like take a daily inventory of saying like, okay, well, where were my frustration points? And I have a pretty
Mm.
good like morning routine that I go through to, reflect on yesterday, get my mind right for today, and do
Yeah.
a bit of planning. But a lot of it is like taking that emotional inventory and saying like, okay, well, what made me like spike up a little bit, and what was that? And so I think it's just like asking better questions sooner and more frequently. And
Yeah.
so if I have something come up, then I need to address it in that day. If I said like anything at all. And so, people on my team know like when I'm like, hey, can I flag something with you, or can I chat through something? Normally that means like, Josh has a tizzy or something that he's but they know, and I try to preface all this stuff too, because it like reminds me of why I'm doing it. Like, hey,
Yeah.
like I wouldn't be giving this to you, or I wouldn't be bringing this up if I didn't care about you. And
Yes.
so I'm like,
Yeah.
out of anything, that's what I want you to hear, is that like the relationship is most important. And if I suck at using the right words, I ask for grace because it might be just a really crappy first draft. And so I think like being able to ask for grace and extending grace, but knowing that I'm committed to constantly working on our relationship because I'm reflecting on a daily basis, that has been super helpful. So I haven't had like major um, buildups, probably within the last year, some more
Yeah.
than I probably should have let on, or like allowed to fester. But I will say that like that reflection, the language that I use, and then just like reminding myself why I'm doing it, that's been very, very powerful to help me in that direction.
And there have been just so many words of wisdom in here, Josh. I love all of it. Now, before I ask you the last little three-part question, people are going, yeah, I really like what this guy is laying down. I would love to connect with him, learn more about him, follow his journey, try and glean whatever additional insight and wisdom I can off of him. Where should we send them to?
Yeah, honestly, the majority of the stuff that we put out is on LinkedIn. So I'd say connect with me on LinkedIn. And then from there, you can sign up for a newsletter. We try to break down really good nuggets. And I'm one that like I've had to learn the hard way because that's the only way that I learn. And so I like to use a lot of my unfortunate stories to unpack lessons and how it applies to my day-to-day living or how we consult with organizations. So definitely check me out on LinkedIn, and then you can subscribe to the newsletter there. That will be the best kind of real-time information, if you will.
Awesome. All right, Josh. Last question for you. What are you reading, watching, and listening to these days?
Oh, baby. Yeah. So, all right. This is going to kind of be geeky. So I'm
Sweet.
reading this book called The Unseen Realm,
Ooh.
and it is about the spiritual realm. And it's absolutely fascinating and like blowing my mind, just the different perspectives. And so regardless of, what your faith tradition is and stuff like that, I just think there's like really impressive uh, just thoughts in there that just like make you question a lot of things. So that is what I'm currently reading. In terms of listening to, I gotta pull up. I'm actually not in a season of listening to a lot, which is like really, really interesting. I'm trying to, like, when I run, like, not listen to anything. And with three kids, I don't really have much time other than that. And then, yeah, we're not really watching. I'm like super boring outside of the things that I care about. So, Unseen Realm is really, really good. And I am reading a couple books around. I think her name's Charlotte Mason. So my kids go to a charter school, and basically rooted in classical education. And so,
Ooh.
kind of the philosophy that they glean from is this lady Charlotte Mason from like the late 1800s. And so, just like learning about her and her different philosophies. One of them is like habits of learning, and so naturally that one caught my eye. So those are the two things I got for you.
Awesome. Well, Josh, my friend, truly thank you for your time, for this discussion, for all the stories that you shared, because those are just, a lot of people hopefully hear those and they can then find representations in their own life of, oh, I have a story, right? I haven't even recalled this part of my life in a long time, but this actually helps inform who I am. Find anyone who's generous enough to share those types of stories often inspires others to find those in your life. So I deeply appreciate you, Josh. Thank you so much for your time
I
today.
appreciate you as well, my friend. Thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, this was a joy.
Good. I'm glad. And we will see you all in the next episode of They Don't Teach Us in Law School.